Joe Coburn now on BBC Two with the day's political developments and PMQs.
It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative peer Ed Vaizey, Labour MP and candidate for West Yorkshire Mayor Tracy Brabin, Liberal Democrat MP Layla Moran and Daily Telegraph Associate Editor Camilla Tominey. Today,
we now know that the Oxford vaccine also reduces transmission, and that will help us all to get out of this pandemic, frankly.
We'll look at why the latest vaccine news might point to the way out. And as testing for new COVID variants continues, why it might not.
There's nothing wrong being woke.
Ed Vaizey agrees with Boris Johnson on that and says there's no point in a war against woke. Tony Blair didn't mind a union flag or two. Should Keir Starmer follow suit? He'll be asking Boris Johnson the questions at PMQs live at noon. Now, yesterday, you may remember, we were talking about the threat posed by variants and mutations of COVID-19. Today, we have reason to be more cheerful following the results of the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine study. Let's take a look at some of the paper headlines. The Daily Mail has the Oxford jab game changer, and this is how the Times has headlined it. Oxford jab does reduce spread of coronavirus. Obviously, that's very important in terms of cutting transmission. Let's get a little bit more detail with an expert, virologist Dr. Chris Smith, who joins us. Chris, tell us about the good news. Why is it good news, the results of this study?
Well, hitherto, we weren't sure whether it was possible to have the vaccine and, while being protected from developing severe disease, in other words, COVID, nevertheless still contract the infection. And if you can contract the infection, you can pass on the infection. So there was still a worry we'd end up in this unenviable position of having a whole bunch of people vaccinated, but still capable of transmitting the infection to people who weren't yet vaccinated. So we weren't therefore so clear about what the pathway would be to stepping back, as Chris Whitty put it, from the lockdown. The fact that we're getting more insights into this and more clarity around the fact that when you have the vaccine, you're better protected and that you won't just be protected from disease, you'll also be protected from transmission. That's very welcome news. And while it goes for one vaccine that's the case, because they all provoke similar immune responses, it's very likely that the same is going to apply for Pfizer's vaccine, which is the other one that's been part of the rollout here in the UK.
Well, that is hugely reassuring, as is also some of the answers to questions about the gap between the two doses, because, again, there were fears that it might reduce the efficacy.
The case for AstraZeneca's vaccine is quite clear. There is a paper in The Lancet where they've actually shown that with time and the greater elapse of time, you'd build a more mature immune response to the vaccine and therefore to the virus. Now, the uncertainty here is whether that's true across the age spectrum, because one of the things that we need a bit more information on, and there is evidence that perhaps not everyone's immune system of all ages responds the same way, we need to find this out. Do some people, for instance, need a sooner second dose than other, perhaps younger people? That's still a question that needs to be answered. But for the average person, it does look like the longer you leave it, the better the protection's going to be, which is why Matt Hancock told the Today programme today that actually they think that the current strategy is the right one.
Right, OK, so they're going to continue with that strategy of that gap. But what about the problem of the variants? I said we talked about it yesterday, which we did, and we know now that that surge testing is continuing, that door-to-door testing, and particularly looking at places like Liverpool and Bristol as well. How worried should we continue to be when you set it against the good news that you've outlined?
Well, all viruses mutate and change. This one is no exception, and we did anticipate that this was a possibility. Thankfully, coronaviruses do change a bit more slowly than other viruses that we have a long track record of trying to fight a battle with, like the flu, for example. But the fact that we're seeing these variants emerge And when you say the South Africa variant or the Brazilian variant or the British variant, what's interesting here is that these viruses are settling on very similar changes to the virus in all these independent locations. And that's because the virus is evolving and it's developing changes which optimize the spread of the virus. And the good news is that we can actually optimize our vaccines. As the virus changes, we can change our vaccines. The downside of this is that we will have to obviously look at how well the existing vaccine stock and therefore the degree of protected people are still protected. And that needs to be taken into account. But the other thing we need to be thinking about is, well, what's the next step? As the virus changes going down the path, how are we going to keep step with it? And that's where monitoring comes in. And that's where the UK is actually a world leader.
Chris, can I ask you to sort of just step back then for a moment and sort of give us your assessment in terms of a balance of risks? You've set out the pros. We know now that there is an issue with the variants and how effective the vaccine currently might be. Do you think, though, we are and can see a way out of this pandemic now?
As far as we know, at the moment, the vaccines that we're deploying into people, with a few exceptions, do work against these existing variants. But the reason to be cautious is that as the variants change the shape and structure of the virus, they may change the shape and structure of key parts of the virus that our vaccines are programming the immune system to defend us against. So we always have to have a weather eye on where that's happening, how that's happening, and how we mitigate that. But the fact at the moment that the immune responses being elicited by the vaccines we're using are quite broad, it means that the virus has to change quite radically before it can sidestep that protection. Now, that's not a given that it won't happen, but for the near term, we're pretty confident that we're OK and on pretty thick, firm ice. But in the future, that ice may thin. We have to therefore have a plan in place to control for that. But I think it's reassuring for now, and the faster we can get the maximum number of people vaccinated, we suppress down the number of rolls of the genetic dice that the virus is able to go through, because the more it's growing, the more chances there are that it will disclose changes which enable it to sidestep vaccines. So now we have to move as fast as we can to get the levels of circulation right down so that it doesn't have the chance to evolve beyond our vaccines, at least in this geography. The rest of the world, we're going to have to worry about that as the days go forward.
All right, Chris, thank you very much for all of that.
Pleasure.
And your assessment. Let's put some of that to the panel. Ed, people will want to know when they can get their lives back as much as possible. Listening to all of that, and particularly the news that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine does substantially cut transmission of the virus and the 12-week gap between the two doses is still highly effective. Do you think it changes the government's calculations in terms of when we might open up?
Well, I think this is the problem the government's always faced, and I'm certainly not going to blame the government for this, but because this pandemic is completely novel and the situation changes almost daily, it's extremely hard to navigate or to set out a path where we can, as it were, all get back to normal. I think there is a consensus emerging that we won't get back to normal, I suspect, for many years, in the sense that I think that there will be permanent changes that we will have to incorporate into our daily lives, for example, regular testing at work. But I do think, the vaccine news, I'd almost be tempted to say it's almost too good to be true. Every day brings really good news. I was terrified that, obviously, first of all, there might be logistical problems. Those haven't happened at all. To the government's great credit, the number of people being vaccinated is really astonishing. And secondly, I was terrified that the vaccine might be seen not to be working, yet all the evidence seems to be pointing to the fact that it is working. It's definitely, obviously, helping morale. It's helping, I think, people get through with the feeling that there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes.
But the government has to be very cautious. It can't say, book that summer holiday. It's got to move very cautiously. And I think the tone now that the government has is very good. It's cautious, it's underplayed, it's not triumphalist. But I think no one could ask any government, not this government nor any government, to set out now when we might be free to go back to something resembling normal life.
OK, so you don't think they should change course at this particular point. Tracy, do you think so? Do you think it's now time for the government perhaps soon to revisit the sort of calculations that they've made about opening up, for instance, schools on March the 8th, if everything goes well, or not?
Well, certainly, I second what Ed has said. The absolutely brilliant news about the vaccinations and the way they've been rolled out in communities through the primary care networks and the volunteers and people who stepped up to test the vaccines. It is a really great news story. But I would say that the government now have a really brilliant opportunity to double down on certainly people coming into this country. We have borders that are still porous. The new quarantine measures aren't coming in for 3 weeks. And sadly, we've heard that in North Yorkshire, there's been two outbreaks of the variants. We've had 2 cases of the South African variants linked to travel. So it's really important that the government now acts swiftly to close our borders, to make sure that we don't have a great vaccination program, but variants coming in and people arriving in our airports, just then getting on public transport and potentially spreading the virus around our communities, because it is not working currently. Also, I think the government have a great opportunity over half-term, February half-term, to vaccinate all teachers. And certainly the way that they're going in numbers, we could do all of the teachers in the country across half-term to make sure that schools could open in a timely fashion when it's safe. But also we don't have the chaos of teachers self-isolating, students being sent home. It's really important that the government now jump on this good news and act swiftly and show leadership.
All right, well, you've talked about travel, but you've also talked about schools. Now, Camilla, you'll remember that Boris Johnson said the earliest date that the government would consider returning some more pupils back to school would be the 8th of March. I just want to show everybody the Scotsman, because the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, said coronavirus in Scotland, youngest pupils to return to school in weeks, so before the end of February as lockdown restrictions extended. Now, we are talking about fairly small numbers of children, young primary school children, and those doing practical subjects in secondary school. Do you think today's news on the vaccine, Camilla, will put more pressure on the government to perhaps speed opening up?
Well, certainly, and I think some of the MPs who are in the COVID recovery group are going to be pressuring him heavily in the coming days, because the argument has always been to suppress the virus in the vulnerables so that the NHS is under less pressure, which allows younger people to get on with their lives. And once you've squared off one vulnerable group, the elderly, you then have to focus on the other, children. And equally, I think it's interesting Labour have taken this stance of adding some conditionality to schools reopening by suggesting that teachers should be vaccinated when they aren't in a vulnerable group. And what Tracy's proposing would mean that some people who are more vulnerable than teachers, I believe the OECD suggests that the average age of a UK teacher is 39. If you look at that death rate altogether of 100,000, I think in the under 44 group, there have been 997 deaths. So teachers aren't overrepresented in the bad COVID statistics. And therefore, parents are going to be scratching their heads saying, why put up another barrier? I've got 3 children at home. They're on Zoom calls now, which might explain if my picture's going out and in. Parents are just desperate, not only for their children to recoup some of the educational loss, but also for their physical and mental well-being, to be back in school as soon as possible. That must remain a government priority, surely.
Right. Well, Tracy, do you want to respond?
Absolutely. And certainly I would say to Camilla, we all want students back in school when it's safe to do so. But this isn't about protecting the cohort from getting unwell and dying with COVID. Teachers are potential transmitters. So it's really important that we stop the transmission. And we've seen today the news and the great news that these vaccinations can stop transmission. And I think it's easy to do. We can do it in the half-term holidays. And it isn't an either or. With the way that it's been rolled out, the vaccinations have been so excellent. We can then move on to the JCVI next set of cohort without actually impacting on that, and do teachers as well. It isn't either or.
All right, well, while we've been talking, Camilla mentioned the COVID recovery group of Conservative MPs who have been putting pressure on the government to perhaps give a route map, a clearer route map for opening up. They have said in the last hour or so there needs to be a very good reason for why schools remain shut now we've had this news about the vaccine, Layla.
Yeah, so, I mean, first of all, great news about the vaccine, but treat with some caution. It hasn't been peer reviewed. and I certainly trust the people who've done the study, but nevertheless, we've seen this before, where we've had fantastic news and then there's a caveat that puts a stop on the great plans that are meant to come off the back of it. So I think it is right that the government takes a cautious approach. And on schools, certainly we need to be getting kids back as quickly as possible. But I will say two things to what Camilla said. First of all, she's absolutely right. The evidence around teachers is mixed. There are some who say that it is higher, although not much. It seems to be higher among older males. But it's not just about deaths. It's also about long COVID, which we're knowing more and more about. The all-party group on coronavirus that I chair had a hearing on child transmissibility and schools yesterday. And what was also really clear was there are two sets of parents right now. There are those who are feeling safe, feeling that for them and their family, it's absolutely the right thing to do to go in. And then there's another set who are perhaps clinically vulnerable. And even if you are clinically vulnerable, the advice at the moment is if you're clinically extremely vulnerable, they've had a letter saying if you have the vaccine, you should continue to shield because we don't understand the immune response with them. And we heard from a couple of parents who are wrought with anxiety, had to face battles with the school and the local authority, who had to face fines and potential court orders because they felt that they had to choose between their own health and the children going to school. And it wasn't a choice they wanted to make. And we heard a horrible story. One of them said that one of the pastoral officers at the school, under huge pressure from the DfE and the local authority, said to the mother, well, you've had your time. And suggested that the daughter would be better off in school than having to deal with a bereaved mother. It was heartbreaking. We were in tears. I mean, this kind of pressure that's being put on schools and parents to no matter what go back, that's what we're calling for to stop. But we also need to ensure that schools have a plan to go back. And so the WHO advice right now says wear masks and have better ventilation. Our schools aren't doing that. I think we need to have that in place as well to reassure those parents and teachers.
I mean, there is a debate, obviously, about schools and about when they can safely reopen, and there are differences, as we've been hearing now. But Ed, broadly, some of the concern and worry from people about how cautious the government should be and the country in terms of opening up might stem from some of the commentary that they've been hearing from the EU and some of the leaders in the EU. I mean, we had Emmanuel Macron last week talking about the AstraZeneca vaccine, saying today everything suggests that it is almost ineffective for the over 65s and some say over 60. We had the French European Affairs Minister, Clément Beaune, defending the comparatively slower pace of vaccine rollout in the EU, saying Britain had taken enormous risks, for instance, in using the Oxford AstraZeneca shot on older people. What do you make of all that?
Look, I bow to no one in my admiration for Dominic Cummings and his skill in running the Leave referendum, but even I didn't countenance that he would somehow put a microchip in the brain of some of the leading figures in the EU to effectively become Uber campaigners for Brexit. I mean, I think these comments are absolutely astonishing and very, very silly. It seems to me, I'm obviously a layman, but the evidence is that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine works, and for the leader of one of the major European countries to effectively spread disinformation that it's ineffective is deeply unhelpful. And for leaders to say that Britain is taking risks is absurd. Of course, there is an element of risk because we've put out this vaccine in double quick time, but those are calculated risks by experts who, we may get onto this subject later in the programme, will deserve to have multiple statues built to them when we come out of this. My mother's had the vaccine. I would have the vaccine in a heartbeat. We need to instill confidence. We know in places like France, for example, confidence in the vaccine is about 40% compared to 85% in this country. I find this kind of vaccine nationalism, which is astonishing because clearly the European Union has made big errors in its vaccine procurement, and now the politicians are trying to cover their tracks. It's a terrible thing to see.
And things have really changed, haven't they, Layla? Because last year, I mean, it wasn't just you, there were Labour MPs too, but I think we can show everyone your tweet from last July. Walking away from the EU vaccine scheme is putting ideology ahead of public health. You would think that during a pandemic, ministers would put political dogma aside, but it seems for this government, it's Brexit over vaccines. We had Catherine West, the Labour MP, who actually apologised for what she called dumb and dumber. I think she tweeted for the government not to join up to the EU vaccination programme. Do you want to apologise too?
I don't want to apologise for that. I do continue to believe that by working together internationally on these huge problems, and this pandemic is a global problem, that we need to be working together. And that is what that programme was meant to be about. And the procurement programmes that have happened after that, I mean, you have to wonder, had we been there, we clearly have expertise, would it have ended up the same? But actually, can we just put a moment aside, because the whole thing, and actually I agree with Ed on this, this has not covered the EU in glory. I think Macron's words are frankly stupid and wrong and unhelpful. But what I'm seeing here is the UK and the EU fighting over millions of doses when we have countries in the world that have had none. I need an updated stat for this, but last week, the entire continent of Africa, 1.3 billion people, have had fewer than 100 jabs. And so what the Lib Dems are calling on for the government and the EU and everyone else is to heed the call of the WHO to start some parallel distribution. And I think the scientist you had on earlier who was explaining and alluded to this at the end, if we want to stop variants from spreading and undermining this fantastic vaccine effort, we need to be in lockstep with not just the EU, but everyone in the world. So our suggestion is that once we vaccinated the most clinically vulnerable, the first 4 million, and they've had their 2 doses, at that point, we do what other countries like Norway have said they're going to do and start a parallel distribution. It can be a small proportion, but we have to start now, or we are going to have this problem as a global problem for years and years to come.
Right. Well, I think the government has said it will do that, hasn't put a timescale on it, but we know, of course, don't we, that we will probably, on the orders of vaccines, have more than we need at the beginning. But we're going to move on to Northern Ireland and the issues there over tensions on trade. The Financial Times headline, Michael Gove, urges Brussels to quell rising trade tensions in Northern Ireland. To explain a bit more about this story, we're going to be joined by our Ireland correspondent, Emma Vardy from Belfast. Emma, take us back to what changed on January the 1st this year.
Well, you might have thought that the 1st of January was potentially all the end of the Brexit arguments, but for Northern Ireland, it kind of just started this whole new chapter, because from the 1st of January, a whole new necessary checks and lots of paperwork came in for goods which are crossing from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. And that is because the compromise that was agreed with the EU agreed that Northern Ireland would effectively stay in the EU single market for goods. But why has that created lots of tension here? Well, because it effectively creates this new trade border within the EU, which really upsets unionist communities here. And since the 1st of January, this has gone from just being an agreement on paper to us really seeing what this looks like in practice. So initially that was some delays and disruption to supermarket food. Parcels, there's a big question mark over what's going to happen to online retailers and parcel deliveries. Some big retailers like John Lewis and Debenhams just said we're going to temporarily stop delivering. And then there's all sorts of other things around things like seeds and plants and soil and pets. So we're really seeing what the Northern Ireland Protocol looks like in reality, and that's causing a lot of unhappiness here.
Now, and it's not just that, of course, is it, Emma? Because it's also risen up the political agenda quite dramatically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on Friday night, of course, we saw that almighty row about vaccines with the EU saying it might override part of the Brexit deal. That's led to unionists here, particularly the DUP, saying to the government, right, you override the Brexit deal on your side for the things we don't like with the Irish trade border. And then yesterday, port staff were stood down in Belfast and Larne ports because all this unhappiness has led to growing tensions in the community, graffiti threats and other suspicious behaviour reported by port staff. So it all really came to a head, and we have port staff who carry out those border checks also not at work here today. So now we know that the UK government is asking the EU, we've got to resolve this, and saying, look, can we push back the grace period right back until 2023? That would help take the heat out of some things. It would mean some of the added paperwork won't have to come in for quite some time. And the UK is asking the EU to be more flexible to try to resolve these tensions around the new Irish Sea border.
Right, and Emma, I'm going to ask you what the government is actually doing about this today, but I'm just going to show everybody these tweets from the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, where he says, our commitment to the people of Northern Ireland and our union is unshakable. Recent EU moves have undermined the protocol and understandably provoked concern. That's the agreement. Let me underline that now and in the future, Northern Ireland's place in the UK will be protected and strengthened. He goes on to say what is needed is urgent action from the EU to resolve outstanding problems with the protocol implementation so as to preserve the gains of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and ensure that Northern Ireland benefits from Brexit just like every other part of our United Kingdom. How are they going to actually do that then with what they're planning today?
Yeah, well, look, there's been a real change in tone from people like Michael Gove and Boris Johnson over the last 24 hours. Before, they were kind of saying, look, these problems are all teething problems, we can sort them out. Now they're actually really asking the EU to be pragmatic and flexible rather than trying to stick to sort of every little letter of the law. They're asking for grace periods to be pushed right back. So, as I was saying, that means that all these new health certificates, which are going to be needed from April for things like supermarket food, which is yet another layer of bureaucracy on goods coming over the Irish Sea. There was a grace period till April. They're saying push that right back until January 2023. Give us a lot more time to sort it out. Kicking the can down the road, you might say. And then they're asking for more flexibility. They're asking for some derogations, things like soil that has to be washed off the tyre of tractors before a tractor could be moved over. They're saying, can we be a bit more flexible on things like this? Make this border in the Irish Sea feel like less of a border. Keep things flowing a bit more easily, which would make unionist communities feel better in Northern Ireland and kind of de-escalate all the tension that's going on.
Emma Vardy, thank you very much there from Belfast. Ed, how do you view this? Is this the EU's fault for their behaviour last Friday, ramping up this issue?
Well, I mean, the EU, again, gifted something to the British government in terms of suddenly invoking Article 16 in the vaccine war, and they made themselves look idiots. I mean, it is amazing. Again, speaking as a Remainer, you see the complete unaccountability of the European Commission. Anyone else, Ursula von der Leyen should have resigned over this. But anyway, there you go.
She dropped it, of course. They retracted it, didn't they, quite quickly?
It, but she's clearly a woeful leader of the Commission. But look, there is a problem here, and this is a circle that cannot be squared. And we had this debate for 4 years as we were exiting the European Union, which is you cannot have no border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. You either have a hard border there or you have something akin to a border on the Irish Sea, and that circle cannot be squared. This is the point. This is the fundamental problem. I don't want to rehearse all these boring Brexit arguments again, but there is a difference between trading with Canada, where people have to put things on a ship or a plane, and people who can put a parcel in the back of a van and drive a mile and effectively be in a different marketplace. But we have foisted upon ourselves this: we mustn't be part of the single market or the customs union. I suspect over the next 5 to 10 years, there won't be a campaign to rejoin the EU, but there will be a campaign to have some sensible arrangement where we can be part of a European free trade association where we, frankly, will have to have some of the European market rules, but that will be a sovereign decision of this country to do it. But we cannot carry on like this. And this situation is pretty untenable.
Right.
I'm sure we will achieve something like a pragmatic solution going forward in the next few weeks. But we are in a sort of Kafkaesque position at the moment, and it's got to be sorted out and addressed.
Well, if it is Kafkaesque, Camilla, can it be sorted out? Wasn't this always the problem at the heart of any agreement on Brexit?
Well, it can be sorted out with the kind of pragmatism that Ed's been talking about. And I'm thoroughly enjoying Ed making the full transition to become the next Sir Bill Cash with his new Brexit sympathies.
What was that, Ed?
We've got a woke discussion later, so we'll be back to normal terms.
Right, go on, Camilla.
Good to hear. But essentially, I think, we keep on seeing, don't we, in recent days and weeks, the EU tying themselves up in unnecessary bureaucratic knots and the rest of the world kind of raising an eyebrow and thinking it's quite preposterous. As Emma pointed out there, this demand, for instance, to have soil washed off wheels as they travel over the Northern Ireland border is completely ridiculous. I think the grace period makes sense in the sense of ironing out some of these issues. But as is ever the case with a mutual agreement, and this is agreement between two sides, not dictated by one side, then of course pragmatic solutions should be found.
Right. Well, Tracy, in your mind, what is the solution? Do you think it can be found? Because there are serious issues at stake here, perhaps not just the teething problems as constituted by Boris Johnson, but also about the communities in Northern Ireland.
Well, certainly, I would agree with everybody that the EU really didn't cover themselves in glory over the last few weeks. But part of this problem has been created in the awful negotiations during Brexit. And I remember those awful days with a packed chamber and people being incredibly rude to each other and things being said. But the idea that there would be no border in the Irish Sea, that there would be no checks and balances required, and Boris Johnson saying in public, you know, if you get a request for paperwork, then write to me. So the people of Northern Ireland have been told one thing, and now the grim reality is kicking in. And certainly I'm sure most people watching this will see some of their parcels that they've ordered now taking more time to arrive. And of course in Northern Ireland that is, you know, 100 times the problem. And certainly workforce being stepped down from ports because they are worried for their safety.
Yeah.
This alerts us all to the need for a shared solution so that we can keep that peace process.
Well,
The way that we fought so hard to keep people safe in Northern Ireland. And obviously the grace period gives people time and opportunity to get round the table, to find those solutions, to work with businesses, to work with the people of Northern Ireland, to find something that works for them. Obviously the devil is in the detail going forward, but at the moment what we must do is dial down the rhetoric and make it safe for the people of Northern Ireland and protect that really precious peace process.
Right, but Leila, it's interesting that both Camilla and Tracy have talked about this shared. It was a shared agreement. It was agreed on both sides. I mean, do you see that the fact that the EU, even briefly, tried to renege or cancel part of the agreement will make it more likely that the UK government will think it could do the same if need be in the future?
Well, I mean, if we want to go back to the Internal Markets Bill and things that the UK has done, I don't think the tit for tat here is helpful, and it's very good. And I did literally tweet good when the EU said that it was going to reverse that decision, because it was utterly silly of them to have even floated it in the first place. But the bigger issue here is I think one of pragmatism. And what worries me a bit is that the DUP, having been, you know, hard-hatted supporters of Brexit, voted it through all the way, now are saying that in their 5-point plan, they're going to oppose all protocol-related things that come through the Assembly. And that is exactly the opposite of the kind of attitude that we need now. Naomi Long, who's the alliance leader in the Assembly, has called for them to put this to one side. It's actually going to cause the problems to get worse. And I think what people in Northern Ireland and everywhere just want right now, and as someone who clearly didn't want us to be in this position and argued that this would always end up coming down to the Northern Irish border, it was always there that the nub of the problems were going to lie. We expected that this was going to happen. The intransigence of the DUP right now is just simply unhelpful.
All right, we're going to leave it there, but Ed has trailed rather conveniently what we are now going to talk about, which is an article that he wrote. Here it is. Britain's war on woke won't work. Not as easy to say as you might think. Ministers want to drum up outrage, but elections are still won from the centre. But Ed, when it comes to issues of identity and statues of historic figures, which you talk about in the article, shouldn't the Tory party have a view?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question. I mean, Oliver Dowden, the Culture Secretary, wrote to all our museums telling them what they could and couldn't do with their statues. We've long had a principle that ministers don't interfere with what museums do and do not do with their collections. And by doing that, Oliver, it means that when they come for the Elgin marbles, people are going to say, well, Oliver Dowden, you were free with your opinions on statues. What's your view on the Elgin marbles? So we've always allowed museums to be independent. I mean, everyone will have views. What I object to is the sort of trailing, dare I say it, in the Sunday Telegraph, Camilla, of various initiatives which are meant to sort of be anti-woke. Which I think are not helpful. I think they carry on a sort of culture war, and dare I cite a foreign figure, but it feels like Don Quixote tilting at windmills. I think 99% of people are not involved in a war on woke, and I do think it's sensible to have a debate about our history and to put it in context. And things I object to, for example, are the National Trust carries out a perfectly respectable academic exercise about the links of the houses that it looks after with money that was made from slavery. That just adds to the sum of human knowledge, adds to our understanding of history, but it suddenly becomes a culture war and people saying, well, the National Trust can't be doing this. It's terrible. It's losing touch with its members. It's awful.
Right.
I don't agree with that at all.
Well, Camilla, are ministers waging war on woke in your paper?
Well, I think what the Telegraph is trying to do is have diversity of opinion. And I think the concern is that the so-called woke brigade seem to dictate things so that they become a fait accompli, and institutions follow suit, kind of blindingly following what they believe to be some sort of moral high ground, while the silent majority looks on and tries to question and then gets accused of being a bigot if they contradict what the so-called metropolitan elite are thinking at any given time. I think the brandishing of people as woke is as unhelpful as suggesting that anyone is anti-woke is therefore some sort of frothing at the mouth, rabid right-winger. I also think that we should have these open debates. You know, it's perfectly acceptable to be in the centre, Ed, but what I wouldn't say is acceptable in politics necessarily is to kind of be sitting on the fence, not having the courage to express an opinion. I think what people love in politicians is people who have an opinion and are able to express it and defend it, but are also able to listen to others.
Right, Layla, I'm going to come to you, but just to say to our viewers, Camilla, we can hear you perfectly. Your picture is freezing a bit, probably because your kids are using the Wi-Fi. Ed, you wanted to come back though briefly.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's very unfair of Camilla to say that people in the centre can't have opinions. I expressed my opinion in my article where I said the war on woke I felt was absolutely pathetic. That was a centrist expressing a very strong opinion, not sitting on the fence.
Layla?
Let's ban the word woke. I mean, the whole thing.
Oh, really?
I've got to the point now where
you're fed up with woke.
It's a way of creating an other. And I think there is a general sense right now, certainly post-Brexit, but more generally, I think globally, look at America, that people want countries to come together. People want populations to listen to each other, to respect each other. I don't think anyone from any part of the political spectrum, I hope, is suggesting that, you know, we stop having opinions, we stop having a discussion, some of them very passionately held. And I completely agree that actually what we need to be now focusing on is listening, talking. These issues are complex. They need discussing. They're not going to go away. And it's important that we talk about them.
Right, it is. But hang on. But Layla, issues of identity. Yeah, well, that's the issue. Issues of identity are important to people, aren't they?
They
on
are,
a whole range of subjects. And in the end, do people not have to come down on one side or the other?
I think people need to have that discussion. And if being woke means that you're someone who wants to have a discussion about the way that society is progressing, well, I would argue that actually most people are woke. But let's just get rid of the word, because that will have caused some people to go, oh, no, I'm not. Actually, let's have the discussion. The issues around the rights of minorities in this country, how there has been systematic racism in this country, that we need to be better educated about our own history and our own past and what that means for modern society. That's a great discussion to have.
Right.
But to label those who want to have the discussion as one thing and everyone else who doesn't want to have it as another creates a wedge. And I think that's the...
Well, Tracy, how do you see it? Do you think elections, you want to be the Mayor of West Yorkshire, do you think elections are won from the centre in the way you've heard Ed and Layla perhaps describe, or do you need to have a strong opinion on issues that are seen as important to people, like the issue of patriotism, for example?
Well, certainly I would say the idea that we focus on what is and what isn't woke, I really genuinely believe it is a massive distraction from some of the most important things we need to tackle in our society. And Layla mentioned institutional racism, and certainly after Grenfell and Windrush, those are the conversations we should be having rather than statues and what pronouns people use and other things that are being raised about what is and what isn't woke. And certainly the people of West Yorkshire will have their opinions about what they want to see in their communities, what they want to see celebrated. And we can have those discussions, absolutely. But certainly when there's over 100,000 people have died from the massive pandemic that is destroying communities and families, I do feel that this is not necessarily the perfect time to have conversations about what is and what isn't woke. But you raise the idea of... Sorry, go on.
Well, I just want to let Camilla come back in on that, what you've said. Camilla?
Well, I just think that, yes, of course, there is room for a debate about racism. And in fact, the real issue one wants to tackle when it comes to that are real issues of whether people of colour are being denied jobs or given lower wages or discriminated against in the sporting arena. It's not necessarily a discussion about statues or indeed the kind of language that one uses when one wants to discuss really serious issues. So I think perhaps people are getting fed up with the agenda being skewed down kind of strange minority rabbit holes rather than dealing with the issue as a whole in a kind of mature manner. But also I think people are put off somewhat when people take the moral high ground and suggest that if they think that statues perhaps shouldn't be torn down without a consensus opinion on whether that should happen, that suddenly they're castigated into the racist or bigot pile. I think that really puts people off. And in fact, actually, it creates even more division. It creates even more resentment, which is precisely the opposite of the direction of travel we want to be in the 21st century.
All right, I'm going to break in at this point and introduce Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC's political editor. And Laura, and just sort of continuing this discussion, because The Guardian has a story, a leaked report from a strategy document of Labour, which says, revealed, strategy for Labour to win back red wall. What's it consist of?
Well, there are some suggestions in there, largely from focus groups, as we understand it, that Keir Starmer, who's not that far off a year in his job as leader of the Labour Party, somehow isn't quite cutting through to voters in parts of the country where Labour has to make up ground if they've got even a faint hope of getting back into power anytime soon. And what this sort of suggests is that he isn't really cutting through, and it explores some of the issues that you have been touching on in the last few minutes. Should a Labour leader, to use the jargon, be wrapping himself in the flag in order to try to appeal to what people who, run focus groups would see as traditional Labour Party voters? And not surprisingly to our viewers, there's some on the left who've been very concerned about things that they've seen. For example, Keir Starmer having the union flag behind him when he's given some statements on television. But I think, as you've been hearing in the discussion, I think there's always a danger with this kind of thing, that actually people who are in the mainstream of all political parties think it's very easy to have noisy, hot debates in SW1 about all of this, but actually turning that into the issues that most voters really engage in is another project indeed.
Right. Well, do you agree with the focus that's come out of these groups, Tracy, which is the party must make use of the flag, veterans and dressing smartly to win back those red wall voters? Is that what you'll be doing in your campaign?
Well, certainly I would say I haven't seen the report, but it's one organisation that's run focus groups. They're using their own particular type of language. But there is work to be done. I mean, 2019 was absolutely devastating for the Labour Party. We lost amazing colleagues and friends. We need to do the work about how we rebuild that trust with the public for us in controlling the economy and protecting the NHS, and how we ensure that the public understand how our vision of rebuilding Britain. So you won't be surprised to know that obviously the Labour Party is doing lots of things around how we make sure that that conversation, that relationship is really clear, and how we win again in 2024. But certainly, as somebody that spent a year in the Parliamentary Armed Forces scheme, where you choose a force, and I was with the Army and spending time with them, I am patriotic. And I am really proud of our armed forces. And of course, patriotism and the flag is not new to the Labour Party. It has been part of our campaigning in 1997, on battle buses and elsewhere. So I think it's unfortunate that this is what has been focused on, because certainly it is about us listening to the public. And certainly I've done a lot of phone banking recently, you won't be surprised to know. No. And certainly patriotism isn't a priority for the people of Yorkshire at the moment. What they care about is the vaccination, it's about schools opening, it's about the practical things in their lives.
All right, we're going to actually let all the viewers know that there will be a minute's silence in the House of Commons ahead of PMQs. You won't be surprised to hear that is in remembrance and commemoration of Captain Sir Tom Moore. That will, to some extent, dominate, won't it, at the beginning of PMQs?
It will, certainly at the beginning, and I think it will set the tone, certainly for the first part of the question and answer session today. And I think it is, of course, a marker of how, one person who had their own idea to do something on a relatively small scale, did capture people's personal imaginations, the public's imaginations, and also the political imagination, because he became a symbol during a very hard time. And you've seen interaction with politicians. The Prime Minister's been in touch with the family in the last day or so. So I think that will be quite a moving moment.
Yes, and we're seeing pictures of him there. And yes, he's an inspiration to many people. Ed, it's difficult to overstate what he means to so many in the country. Ed?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, it's the most astonishing story, and his life history itself in terms of serving in the war and during the campaign in Burma. I mean, he's been an absolute inspiration, and it is a tragic way that he's ended his life. But he lived his last life. He lived the last year of his life. He packed more in than most of us will pack in a lifetime. His modesty, in which he, as the sort of media spotlight turned on him, was an inspiration. And it was kind of the distillation, if you like, of the British spirit.
Layla?
What an incredible man who captured the nation's hearts. And I was really struck, I think, in this last year, how the thing that he became famous for was the thing that ultimately got him, and he became part of the 108,000 people who have now passed away. It's just so tragic, and I think to his family in this week, they must be devastated, but I hope they're taking heart from just seeing the outpouring of love, and it is love from all across, not just this country, but in fact the world.
I think, Jo, there is also going to be later tonight another public acknowledgement. I think the Prime Minister will confirm this at the beginning of Prime Minister's questions, that there's going to be a clap for Captain Tom Moore at 6 o'clock tonight, which may remind people, recreate some of those moments of the early in the pandemic when we saw the clap for carers, which brought so many people together.
Well, let's go into the chamber.
In raising money to support the NHS charities caught the nation's mood at the most difficult time. He exemplified the best of our values. I know the whole House will want to join me in sending our condolences to his family and his many friends. I invite members to now join me for a minute's silence to commemorate Sir Tom's life and to pay our respects to those who have lost their lives as a result of the COVID and their families and friends. Order. We now come to questions to the Prime Minister. I will first call the Prime Minister to answer the engagements question. I will then call Claire Anna to ask her supplementary. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Captain Sir Tom Moore, or Captain Tom as we all came to know him, dedicated his life to serving his country and others. His was a long life lived well, whether during his time defending our nation as an army officer, and last year bringing the country together through his incredible fundraising drive for the NHS that gave millions a chance to thank the extraordinary men and women of our NHS who protected us in this pandemic. As Captain Tom repeatedly reminded us, please remember tomorrow will be a good day. He inspired the very best in us all, and his legacy will continue to do so for generations to come. Mr. Speaker, we now all have the opportunity to show our appreciation for him and all that he stood for and believed in. That's why I encourage everyone to join in a national clap for for Captain Tom and all those health workers for whom he raised money at 6 p.m. this evening. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Let's head over to Northern Ireland with Claire Hanna. Claire Hanna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and certainly echo those words about Captain Tom, a decent and inspiring man. The SDLP warned for the last 5 years about the destabilising impact Brexit would have in Northern Ireland, though we take no pleasure in the disruption nor in the injury some feel to their British identity. The last few days have seen a rash and thankfully withdrawn decision by the European Commission, which was condemned by all parties here and both governments, and unfortunately followed by sporadic criminal behaviour and threats. Will the Prime Minister, in affirming the rule of law in Northern Ireland, to consider seriously the impact of their words and work together through the available structures to ensure that the new arrangements work for everybody in Northern Ireland?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly agree with the Honourable Lady that it was most regrettable that the EU should seem to cast doubt on the Good Friday Agreement, the principles of the peace process, by seeming to call for a border across the island of Ireland. And I can tell her that we will work to ensure that there are no such borders. We will respect the peace process and indeed no barriers down the Irish Sea, and that the principle of unfettered access across all parts of our United Kingdom is upheld.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I join the whole House in paying tribute to Captain Sir Tom Moore, who was indeed an inspiration to all of us and a beacon of light at a time of darkness and a true gentleman. I'm sure my right honourable friend is aware that my 10-minute rule bill would increase the maximum penalty for death by dangerous driving to life imprisonment. The policy and the bill have cross-party support. The policy has government support, the bill does not. The government says it will introduce the policy in its sentencing bill, of which we have seen as yet no sign. So will the government now give government time to my bill to ensure this necessary change is put on the statute book as soon as possible?
Prime Minister.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend, and she's absolutely right to campaign for punishments that fit the crime, and we're therefore bringing forward exactly those changes, Mr. Speaker, and in our forthcoming sentencing bill. And our proposals, I believe, will go as far, if not even further, than those that she wants, by raising the maximum penalty for causing death by careless driving when under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and they will tighten the law for those who cause serious injury by careless driving.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join you and the Prime Minister in sending my condolences to the family of Captain Sir Tom Moore? He, perhaps more than anyone, embodied the spirit of Britain, and he will be sadly missed. And I welcome the initiative that the Prime Minister spoke of a clap this evening. Mr. Speaker, our thoughts are also with the family of Maureen Colquhoun, the first openly lesbian MP and a great champion of women's rights. Mr. Speaker, let me pay tribute to our NHS and all of those on the front line who are delivering the vaccine. Today, we're likely to hit 10 million vaccinations, which is remarkable. The biggest risk to the vaccine programme at the moment is the arrival of new variants, such as the South African variant. On that issue, the government's own scientist, Sage, said 2 weeks ago, and I quote, "Only a complete preemptive closure of borders or the mandatory quarantine of all visitors upon arrival can get close to fully preventing new cases or new variants." So pretty clear. So why did the Prime Minister choose not to do the one thing that Sage said could prevent new variants coming to the United Kingdom?
Prime Minister.
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, Sage did not recommend a complete ban, and they say that travel bans should not be relied upon to stop importation of new variants. But we do have, Mr. Speaker, one of the toughest regimes in the world, and anybody coming from South Africa not only has to do a test before they come here, but anybody coming from South Africa now, British citizens returning from South Africa now, will find themselves obliged to go into quarantine for 10 days, and they will have an isolations assurance agency checking up on them, and it is illegal now, Mr. Speaker, to go on holiday in this country. It is illegal to travel from South Africa or all the countries on the current red list. And we will be going forward, Mr. Speaker, with a plan to ensure that people coming into this country from those red list countries immediately have to go into government-mandated quarantine hospitality.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm intrigued by the Prime Minister's answer. I don't think he disputes what Stage's view was, that only a complete closure or comprehensive quarantine of all arrivals will work. He doesn't seem to dispute that. He says it simply wasn't a recommendation. I would ask the Prime Minister to publish the full Sage minutes so that we can see what was said in full, or if there's some other advice, perhaps publish that. Because the situation is this: we know the South African variant is spreading across England and measures are in place to try to deal with that. We also know that other variants are out there in other parts of the world. So is the Prime Minister really saying, just as a matter of common sense, is he saying that quarantining all arrivals would make no difference to fighting new variants of the virus? Or is he saying that quarantining all arrivals at the border would make a difference, but it's too difficult to do it?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is the right honourable gentleman who only recently said that quarantine measures were a blunt instrument, and whose Shadow Transport Secretary said that quarantine should be lessened. We have one of the toughest regimes in the world, and I think when he calls for a complete closure of borders, or suggests that that might be an option, Mr. Speaker, he should be aware that 75% of our medicines come into this country from the European continent, 45% of our food. 250,000 businesses in this country rely on imports. It is not practical completely to close off this country, as he seems to be suggesting. What is practical to do is have one of the toughest regimes in the world, and to get on with vaccinating the people of this country, which is what we are doing, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, what he says about the Labour position is complete nonsense. He knows it. It's the 3rd of February 2021. We've new variants in the country, our schools are shut, and our borders are open. Everybody knows there are exceptions, whatever the quarantine regime. Everybody knows that. And that's not what this question is about. The position is this: 21,000 people are coming into this country every day. The Prime Minister's new border arrangements are still weeks away from being implemented and will only affect direct flights from some countries. We know from the first wave of the pandemic that only 0.1% of virus cases came from China, where we had restrictions, whereas 62% came indirectly from France and Spain, where there were no restrictions. Why does the Prime Minister think that the variants of the virus will behave differently and only arrive in the UK by direct flights?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he can't have it both ways. He simultaneously says that he wants the borders to be kept open for freight reasons, or to allow businesses to carry on. I think that was what he was saying, whilst calling for tougher quarantine measures, which is exactly what this government imposed as soon as we became aware of the new variant, Mr. Speaker. And I repeat what you have to do if you want to come into this country from abroad. You have to 72 hours before you fly. You have to get a test, Mr. Speaker. You have to have a passenger locator form. You're kicked off the plane if you don't have it. You then have to spend 10 days, Mr. Speaker, in quarantine. If you come from one of the red list countries, Mr. Speaker, you have to go straight into quarantine. And all this, of course, is to allow us to get on with the vaccination programme. And if it had listened to the right honourable gentleman, Mr. Speaker, we would still be at the starting blocks, because he wanted to stay in the European med Benson's agency, Mr. Speaker, and said so 4 times from that dispatch box.
Keir Starmer.
Nonsense. Don't let the truth get in the way of a pre-prepared gag. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister knows I've never said that from this dispatch box or anywhere else, but the truth escapes him. Mr. Speaker, he describes the current arrangements. If they were working, the variant wouldn't be in the country, the single biggest threat to the vaccine system. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to another area where the government's been slow to act, the cladding crisis. This is affecting millions of people, and I can't tell the Prime Minister how anxious and angry people feel about this. It's now 3.5 years since the Grenfell tragedy, which took 72 lives. So can the Prime Minister tell the House and the country why, 3.5 years on, are there still hundreds of thousands of people living in homes with unsafe cladding, 3.5 years on, and why are millions of leaseholders in homes that they can't sell and facing extortionate costs?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in respect of the Honourable Gentleman's last answer, may I advise him to consult YouTube, where he will find an answer. He raises a very important point about cladding and the predicament of some leaseholders, of many leaseholders, and he is absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. This is a problem that needs to be fixed. This government is getting on with it. 95% of the high-rise buildings with unsafe ACM cladding have been work is either underway, they are either complete or underway to remove that cladding, Mr. Speaker. I very much appreciate and sympathise with the predicament of leaseholders who are in that situation, but we are working to clear the backlog, and I can tell him that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor and the Community Secretary will be coming forward with a full package to address the issue.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, whatever the Prime Minister claims being done isn't working. Because this is the situation. Through no fault of their own, huge numbers of people, especially leaseholders, are stuck in the middle. They are living in unsafe homes. They can't sell, and they're being asked to foot the bill. That's the situation that they are in. Take, for example, Will Martin. He's a doctor who's got a flat in Sheffield. He's been spending his days on the front line fighting COVID in the NHS. He spends his nights worrying about the £52,000 bill that he now has to pay for fire safety repairs. He doesn't want future promises, Prime Minister. He doesn't want to hear that it's all been sorted when he knows that it hasn't. He wants to know here and now, will he or will he not have to pay that £52,000 bill?
Mr. Speaker, we're determined that no leaseholder should have to pay for the unaffordable costs of fixing safety defects that they didn't cause under no fault of their own. And that's why, in addition to the £1.6 billion we're putting in to remove the ACM and the UPL cladding, we are also setting up and have set up a £1 billion building safety fund, which has already processed over almost 3,000 claims. And I sympathise very much with the gentleman Dr. Martin, that he mentions, and I hope very much that his particular case can be addressed in the course of the forthcoming package that will be produced by my right honourable friends.
There are thousands and thousands of people in exactly the same position. I spoke to leaseholders caught in the middle of this on Monday. One of them was Hayley. She's already gone bankrupt, Mr. Prime Minister. She's 27. She bought a flat, she's lost it, she's now bankrupt. It's too late for her. Those leaseholders that I spoke to had 3 very simple asks. This is what they want: immediate upfront funding for unsafe blocks, a deadline of next year to make buildings safe, and protection for leaseholders. We put those forward for a vote on Monday. The Prime Minister says he's determined to do something about it. What did he do? He ordered his MPs to abstain. If the Prime Minister is serious about moving this forward and ending this injustice, will he commit today to those simple asks from leaseholders?
Mr. Speaker, we're getting on with the job of helping leaseholders across the country by remediating their buildings. And in addition to the funds I've already mentioned, I can tell him that we're also introducing a £30 million fund to install alarms and other interim measures. And we're making it very clear to the mortgage industry that they should be supporting people living in such accommodation, and that the and making it clear to all sectors of the industry that people living in such homes should not be tied up in the whole EWS1 process. And that will benefit about 450,000 homeowners, Mr. Speaker. I think he's right to raise the problem, but we're getting on with addressing it, Mr. Speaker. And we're getting on with addressing the fundamental problem that afflicts this country, and that is the COVID pandemic. And that's why I'm pleased that we've now done 10 million vaccines, first vaccinations across the country. And I repeat, Mr. Speaker, had we listened to the right honourable gentleman, we would be stuck at go, because he's shaking his head, but he can check the record. Several times he said that this country should remain in the European Medicines Agency. And if he wishes to on a point of order, to correct me, because he said it was wrong just now, I think he should study the record and he'll find that is exactly what he did. We want to get this country safe again. We want schools to come back. Mr. Speaker, he continues to refuse to say that schools aren't safe, Mr. Speaker. And on the contrary, he spends his time looking at Labour focus groups who tell him that he should stop sitting on the fence.
And Prime Minister,
Mr. Speaker,
no, Prime Minister, just in fairness, I think we've got to be somewhere near the question that was asked, and I don't want you to go around the world answering every problem and issue. There's a lot more questions who's going to allow you to do that, and the first one's coming, Marco Longi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I join the Prime Minister with his moving words towards Captain Sir Tom Moore, who was an inspiration to each and every one of us in this country and beyond, may I say. Mr. Speaker, the Priory Boxing Club in Dudley has produced many champions, including Ryan Aston, who became champion 5 times in this country. May I ask the Prime Minister to join me in paying tribute to Paul Goff at the club, who is working with young boys and girls who are often who have been excluded from mainstream education. And may I ask him also to pay tribute to the council leader, Patrick Harley, who has agreed and is supporting a new school in partnership with the club to ensure that these young people are actually going to be getting academic qualifications, as well increased self-belief and new opportunities for the future.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising this excellent club, and I'm happy to join my honourable friend in paying tribute to the work of Paul Goff and Patrick Harley, everybody at that Priory Boxing Club. And I know from personal experience what a huge difference it can make, not just to young people's fitness, but also to their educational success to attend boxing clubs, Mr. Speaker.
Let's head up to the leader of the SNP in Skye and Lochaber, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with your remarks about the remarkable gentleman, Captain Sir Tom Moore? Everything that he's done, he has been an inspiration to each and every one of us. And I would like to send my condolences to his family and friends. Mr. Speaker, last week, we told the Prime Minister it was wrong for him to visit Scotland in the middle of a pandemic. We told him it was a non-essential visit. Mr. Speaker, this morning, the Daily Record newspaper revealed that the Prime Minister knew that the Livingston plant that he was visiting had an outbreak of 14 COVID cases just 24 hours earlier. There are serious questions to answer. Did the Prime Minister and his advisors know about the COVID outbreak? When did they know? And when did the Prime Minister make the irresponsible decision to go ahead with what was a PR stunt?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can think of a few things more important than to see the rollout of the vaccination programme across this country, to encourage the wonderful companies who are doing great work across the whole of Scotland, to see the commitment of those Scottish scientists to helping us all to defeat the pandemic. And it was fantastic to talk to them, Mr. Speaker. And I would just repeat that the government remains, as I said yesterday, very willing to help Scotland with the rollout of vaccines across the whole of the UK.
Returning to Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
And there is the wow factor once again with the Prime Minister. What an absolute shambles that he's gone to a plant where there was a COVID outbreak, and the Prime Minister can't just explain away this absolutely shocking error of judgment. Anyone can see that his campaign trip to Scotland was utterly, utterly reckless. The Daily Record story is very clear. The Prime Minister and his advisers knew there was a serious COVID outbreak at this plant. They knew the visit posed a risk, but they made a deliberate choice. They made the irresponsible choice. The Prime Minister put politics before public health. Prime Minister, why be so reckless? Is it any wonder that people in Scotland have no faith in this Prime Minister? Isn't he the worst possible leader at the worst possible time?
Mr. Speaker, I think what the people of Scotland want to see is the whole country pulling together and working to develop the vaccine, as that fantastic plant in Scotland is doing. One of the advantages of the Valneva vaccine is that it may be able to combat all sorts of variants in a very comprehensive way. It's amazing, wonderful to see Scottish scientists working to do that. I had a fantastic time. Nobody, by the way, raised that issue with me before or since, and it is my job, Mr. Speaker, to visit every part of this country. Nothing and no one, Mr. Speaker, is going to stop me, and I am very, very proud of the record of the government in rolling out the vaccine. As I say, the offer, it remains open to the Scottish Nationalist Party, where their National Party, if they insist, though they are also nationalists, Mr. Speaker, were there to help the rollout of the vaccine, if do more were they to decide that is necessary, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Closing the attainment gap has always been at the heart of our education policy, and yet we know that the pandemic is having a devastating effect on our children's education. I welcome the Prime Minister's commitment to prioritise the opening of our schools. Would he also agree with me that we must put the catch-up of children's missed education at the centre of our recovery programme?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. That's the single most, I think, of all the challenges now facing the country. It is remedying the damage to children's education. Yes, of course, we've got to clear up the backlog in the NHS. We have problems in the courts, but it is education that is going to be the focus of this government, Mr. Speaker, and repairing the differential learning that's taken place during the crisis.
Let's head to Northern Ireland with Stephen Farry. Stephen Farry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We need to be open and honest on the reasons why the Northern Ireland Protocol exists, but do all we can to make its implementation as easy as possible. So in that spirit, in the talks with the EU that will take place over the coming days, will the Prime Minister make it a priority to seek a UK-EU veterinary agreement, which would help both with respect to the Northern Ireland Protocol, but also all UK food exporters?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, and we do think that it is very important that the protocol should not place unnecessary barriers or barriers of any kind down the Irish Sea. It was, as I said to a colleague earlier, I think it was most unfortunate that the EU seemed to want to impose a barrier across the island of Ireland. We seek to make sure there are no such barriers, Mr. Speaker, down the Irish Sea.
Let's head to Gloucestershire with Lawrence Robertson. Lawrence Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some of my constituents had their Christmases ruined because the heavy rainfall and local inappropriate development caused foul water to enter their homes, causing them great difficulties. So will the Prime Minister appoint a statutory body with the specific and undeniable responsibility of ensuring that no developments can automatically tap into existing drainage systems, and that before developments begin, a full assessment is made of the local drainage capacity, and if that capacity would be inadequate, that the development does not begin until the infrastructure is upgraded?
Prime Minister.
Well, I will study the very interesting proposals that my honourable friend makes, but in the meantime, I will raise them particularly with the Environment Agency, who I think do a fantastic job in managing local areas that are prone to flooding, to putting in the necessary defences. And I know that our colleagues across the House will have seen the work of the Environment Agency across the country, and we're making another £5.2 billion investment into additional flood defences, which I know will benefit his constituents in Gloucestershire and across the country.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister was not born in this country. My parents were not born in this country. I was, but we are all British. There are, however, hundreds of thousands of children, including in my constituency in Streatham, who, like us, born or raised here, are entitled to citizenship but priced out by a £1,012 fee. Without it, they face barriers to university, work, healthcare, renting a home or opening a bank account. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that it's wrong that the government makes 60% profit on these applications? And will he take steps to reduce or even end citizenship fees for children?
Mr. Speaker, I think that British citizenship is a wonderful thing, and it's fantastic that so many EU nationals have taken up the opportunity to become British in the course of the last few years. I'm interested in the point that the honourable lady makes. I will study it, but clearly there are costs that must be borne by the taxpayer, and I think that she will appreciate that citizenship at any time of life is a very considerable prize and worth investing in.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The police have been one of our public services who have been absolutely essential during the pandemic. So will my right honourable friend join me in welcoming the fact that the Kent Police and Crime Commissioner Matthew Scott has announced another 145 police officers during this year, bringing to the total of 800 extra police we have on the streets of Kent, and most importantly that this has been accompanied by a reduction of 17,000 in the crime numbers in Kent this year. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend, who's a long-standing and redoubtable campaigner for law and order and for the police, and I also congratulate Crime Commissioner Matthew, Police and Crime Commissioner Matthew Scott, for what he's doing to back the police and to recruit more police in Kent, and that's why we are putting another 20,000 more officers on the streets of this country, and I think we've already recruited about 6,000, Mr. Speaker.
Let's head up to the North East with Julie Elliott. Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the government responded to concerns from our care workers by stating, "We're immensely proud of all our care workers do." This is a sentiment we all share, yet in the very same statement, the government sought to pass the buck for the way our care workers have been treated by saying the vast majority of care workers are employed by private providers and that the government does not set levels of pay for care workers. Why won't this government commit to ensuring our care workers are paid a wage they can live on?
Mr. Speaker, this government is proud of not only setting up the national living wage, but making sure that we had record-breaking increases both last year and this year. And that is the most important thing we can do for care workers and workers across the country.
Let's head up to see Joy Morrissey. Joy Morrissey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I thank the Prime Minister for prioritising schools during this pandemic. And will the Prime Minister confirm that this remains the case? And on Children's Mental Health Week, will the Prime Minister work with parents and frontline children's charities to minimise the disruption to children and to their mental health caused by this pandemic?
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for what she does to champion this very, very important cause. And it is Children's Mental Health Week this week, and partly in recognition of the extent of the problem and the issue across the whole of the country, we've announced a new youth mental health ambassador who's going to be working with the government, Dr. Alex George, who will be working with the government to underline the importance of mental health resilience, Mr. Speaker, and making everybody in our country better able to deal with some of the problems that life throws in our way.
Into Northern Ireland with Ian Paisley. Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I too express condolences to the family of Captain Sir Tom Moore, an inspirational and wonderful gentleman. Prime Minister, you say that your commitment to Northern Ireland is unshakable. Well, I speak for all of my constituents today when I tell you that the protocol has betrayed us and has made us feel like foreigners in our own country. Tea and sympathy will not cut the mustard. So what is the Prime Minister actually going to do when the Prime Minister realises that the EU will do nothing to help Northern Ireland? Will the Prime Minister use all of the instruments at his disposal? Will he use, if necessary, his parliamentary majority? Will he legislate, if necessary, to remove the impediments to trade in Northern Ireland? And will he be a man of his word and allow businessmen in my constituency to bin the unnecessary documentation that he told us we could bin? Prime Minister, be the unionist we need you to be.
I utterly share the frustration of the honourable gentleman about the way the EU, in particular, the EU Commission, temporarily seem to call for you to use the protocol in such a way as to impose a border contrary to the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, contrary to the letter of the Good Friday Agreement. And we will do everything we need to do, Mr. Speaker, whether legislatively or indeed by invoking Article 16 of the protocol, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that there is no barrier down the Irish Sea, and the honourable gentleman's business constituents, some of whom I know very well and admire very much, can continue to do business unfettered between Northern Ireland and the rest of this country.
Speaker, may I congratulate my right honourable friend on his calm handling of the European Commission's misbehaviour over vaccines in Northern Ireland. Nevertheless, we can learn something from our European friends. Andalusia, a Spanish province of 8 million people, had a COVID death rate of about 190 deaths per million in November, higher than ours at the time. After giving activated vitamin D, calcifidiol, to care home residents and some GP patients, that death rate almost halved, whilst ours was doubling. Can he ask his advisers to look urgently again at the very latest Spanish research about this cheap, safe and apparently effective treatment?
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend, and we will continue to monitor all the evidence about the efficacy of vitamin D and the treatment that he mentions. I'm well aware of it, and indeed we've discussed it before personally, Mr. Speaker, and I'll keep him updated on the review that's currently taking place.
Let's head up to the northwest with Rosie Cooper. Rosie Cooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Scammerdale residents believe that they are an island of forgotten people. It's a 60s new town with very poor public transport and one of the lowest levels of car and vehicle ownership. For many, the only means of getting to doctors, schools, shops or visiting loved ones is through 87 underpasses, many of which flood every time there's rain. Will the Prime Minister ask his officials to work with Lancashire County Council to find and fund a permanent, and I do mean a permanent solution, which doesn't involve providing canoes? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
I appreciate the desire of the honourable lady to. I am aware of the problem that she refers to in the flooding in the underground in the tunnels. We will certainly work with Lancashire County Council to mitigate the problem, to sort it out. But we are, and just to repeat, we have the funds available, and we'll make sure that it's done, Mr. Speaker.
Jenkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We were delighted to hear that Maryport in my constituency of Workington was successful in our bid for a future High Streets Fund. One of my right honourable friend's 50 additional towns announced last August, and a bid I led when I was Deputy Leader of Allerdale Borough Council. We're hoping too for a positive outcome to our Towns Fund bid for Workington. Can I take this opportunity to thank my right honourable friend for all he's doing for my constituents and levelling up across the United Kingdom, and invite him, as soon as he is able, to visit my constituency to see for himself its potential.
Well, I want to thank my honourable friend, who is a fantastic advocate of the people of Workington, and never fails, Mr. Speaker, to put their interests before me. And I will do everything I can to help him, and I will check my diary commitments to see when I can get there, and I hope it will be as soon as possible.
Let's head to Wales with Howell Williams. Howell Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Delivery of important letters, packets and parcels in the Carnarvon area have been delayed for days and weeks by a COVID outbreak amongst local postal workers. The Prime Minister will, I'm sure, join me in wishing my constituents a speedy recovery. But what is his government doing during this health crisis to make sure that the once world-beating, but by now privatised Royal Mail is sufficiently robust to fulfil its duty to the public, particularly in rural areas?
Mr. Speaker, the most important thing we can do, and I pass on my sympathies to all those affected by the outbreak of COVID that he describes. I think the most important thing we can do is continue to roll out the vaccination programme, and we want to get key workers such as postal workers as fast as we possibly can. We're already at 10 million across the whole country. We've got to get down the JCVI groups 1 to 9, Mr. Speaker, the most vulnerable groups. But postal workers over 50 will certainly be included in that group. But after that, we want to get down to all key workers who come into regular contact with others and who may be exposed to the virus, Mr. Speaker.
Kemp with Tracy Crouch.
So, Prime Minister's questions continues. We're going to leave it there for the moment. If anything dramatic comes up, we will, of course, return. Let me bring in my guest for this part of the show, Mims Davis for the Conservatives and Employment Minister. Hello to you. Luke Pollard for Labour, Shadow Environment Secretary. And, of course, Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC's political editor, is still here with us. Just before I open up the discussion, just to say that, as Laura had already mentioned, the Prime Minister confirmed that at 6 o'clock this evening there will be a national clap for Captain Sir Tom Moore and everything he did and represented, and for all the money and morale he raised in his last year of life. Laura, Keir Starmer went on the issue of borders and hotel quarantining. Now, this has been a theme for the last few days. Are they making headway?
Well, it depends how you look at it. So we know now that on the 21st of January, the Government Scientific Committee discussed this issue and whether or not the UK shouldn't just be restricting travel into the country. What they should be doing is if anybody comes in from somewhere at risk, they should then be forced to go straight to a hotel rather than just promising to isolate. Now, we know that Sage said at that meeting the only way to completely be sure about any variants would not be coming into the country would be to have a sort of complete quarantine thing, to have a complete ban from, sorry, not quarantine, to have a complete ban of people coming in from basically every other country. But it wasn't until the 27th of January that the government then finally agreed on there to quarantine people coming in. And it's the 3rd of February, and even that policy still hasn't come in. So there's a lot of toing and froing on this, which I'm sure our viewers have been following because it's been going on for a long time. But Labour believes that the government is still vulnerable on this issue because there are still 20,000 people coming into the country from different places, and there still isn't a date for when that hotel quarantine policy is actually meant to come in. And it may well not be for another couple of weeks. So as one Tory MP suggested, the heating might be cranked up to full on, you know, the vaccine programme's going at great guns, but the window's still open because there's still a gap here where people could be coming in from other parts of the world.
Right, well, Mims, what's the problem? What's taking so long? Mims, we can't hear you at the moment. You may have muted yourself accidentally. Let's try you again. What's taking
sorry, Joe.
You're with us.
Perils of the mute.
It's all right.
Apologies.
It is a hazard of being virtual. Yes, what is the problem? What's the delay? Why isn't this in place right now?
Well, my understanding is that we're in the process of the procurement and the practicalities of making this feasible. But to say that, you know, you can just sort of randomly come into the UK and do exactly what you want is simply not the case. And of course, at Sage, various scenarios and papers are put forward. I'm not part of those conversations. And of course, what's practical and feasible needs to be looked at. And of course, we need to balance and obviously I've got Gatwick Airport in my patch, so we've got to balance the need of freight, wider border and business issues. But of course, you can't simply go on holiday. And I thank many of my constituents as well who've been in contact with me, who've been desperately keen to go and see sick and ill loved ones around the globe, who simply just see it as impossible.
Right,
and
well, let's have a look.
We do know that the police will be tracking you when you come into the UK, that you will have to explain why you're coming into the UK. You will need that paperwork, you'll need that test and that clear test. And of course, the next stage of this, covering all of the red zone, we'll look forward to in terms of those hotels and the procurement around it.
All right.
But people know you can't just simply wander around the UK and not adhere to quarantine.
Right, but
and
this
our
is
border force is tracking people.
Mims, this is about degrees, isn't it? We know we've had the policy outlined to us, but as we sit here today, it's still not in place, that hotel quarantine policy. And when we talk about the threat posed by the new variants, whether homegrown or coming from abroad, they may be resistant to the vaccines. Why isn't the government putting in place measures for all UK arrivals to quarantine in hotels right now if the variants are the biggest threat to us opening up again?
Well, we have got the interventions around postcoding and tracking those specific variants, around door-to-door testing and the additional understanding of community transmission. And I know how baffling this has been, and it's absolutely brilliant that it's our scientists that have uncovered what's been going on, because, you know, earlier in December, we were in a lower tier here and simply couldn't understand why, despite everyone taking the right precautions and listening, but of course, right next door to Kent, what was actually going on. So we are always making sure that we update the guidance. You're right, there's still further work to do in terms of procuring those hotels and what happens when people come into the UK. Yeah. Going on holiday is legal. You must do that passenger location form. The police are doing more approaches at the borders as well, reminding people. And I'm personally really pleased that we're dealing with the influencers and people, frankly, going on holiday and flouting this, because I think this is wound people up something chronic. And I'm glad that the Home Secretary has taken this on as well.
All right, Laura.
But Mims, if, as you say, Gatwick's in your constituency, there must, as well as many people worried about their jobs at Gatwick Airport, there must be many hotel rooms that are currently empty because there has been such a downturn in the travel industry. Why is it so difficult for the government to actually block book hotel rooms around the country, to do everything that we possibly can to close down our borders to dangerous variants that might be coming in for other countries?
Yeah, and we recognise the Brazil issue, the Portuguese issue, and hence the red zones. My understanding is those conversations are ongoing. I can't praise Gatwick broad enough. They've been absolutely brilliant in terms of, you know, balancing the fact that they would love to stay open, but the fact that there is public health concerns. They're setting up new job centres there. They have been part of the testing regime.
But Minister, on this specific point, you know, ministers and officials were talking about this policy for weeks before a final decision was actually taken. A final decision was taken to do it on the 27th of January. We're now then another week on the 3rd of February, and it's still not happened. I mean, the government's grappled with so many complicated things during this pandemic. Some have gone well, some have gone less well. Why does booking hotel rooms seem to just be stumping the government?
Yeah, and I'm as keen as you to see this, because those people coming through Gatwick, for example, directly affect my constituency. My understanding is this is being refined, what is feasible, how we balance the trade, business, and also the necessity of having borders open for food, for other transits is being worked out. Obviously, this sits with DFT and also PHE, and as you hear with SAGE, I don't think we're very far away. Of course, it's a priority. But the message is clear for people. Going on holiday is illegal. You must take that pre-test before you return. You must quarantine. Yep. There'll be additional police at Gatwick Airport or any other airport, and you will be visited by Border Force, and you should be isolating. And this should have been going on all the time, coming from those red zones.
OK, Mims, Luke, you've been sitting patiently listening to all of this. There is an issue and a difference between what is practical and realistic and whether it would make a real difference when it comes to the variants. Let's just test what Labour is actually proposing. You want a comprehensive hotel quarantine system. It would apply to all UK arrivals, not just those coming from this red list of countries. But there would be exceptions. So haulage is one exception. We heard from your Shadow Home Secretary. Any others?
Well, I think the general public will be bemused by what we've just heard, and the fact that when we're looking at a crisis of this scale, that our borders are still open. And when we can see countries like Australia, New Zealand, that have made real progress as island nations in limiting travel to that country and then having proper quarantine measures when they get there, then I think the delay is simply unacceptable. We've got the deepest recession of any industrialized country and one of the highest death tolls. And the lesson for me, surely, from the pandemic is to act faster, act bolder, and act quicker. And that's not what, sadly, we're seeing from this. Of course, there should be a certain number of exceptions to that.
And what are they?
Well, you've mentioned haulage. I don't have all that full list of exceptions in front of me at the moment. But the key thing is that at the moment, people are able to fly into the country and they're able to travel within there when actually we're making huge progress with the vaccine. There's a huge amount of effort that's been positive, but we risk undoing that work and letting in mutated versions of the virus, both from those countries that have had them identified, but also from countries where the identification capacity doesn't yet exist.
Right.
So there could be additional mutations entering our country. And that's why having a comprehensive quarantine seems to be not only the prudent thing to do, but it's something that, if we listen to the language of ministers, should have already have happened.
All right.
Isn't. And that's why people are finding it frustrating.
All right. So there are some exceptions, you say, under your policy. But let me just put this scenario to you, Luke, because under Labour proposals, if someone living in Northern Ireland, for example, wanted to attend a funeral in the Republic of Ireland, when they came back, your plans would mean that that person would have to quarantine in a hotel at their own cost, and it's estimated to be around £1,500 per person, let's say, for the duration of the quarantine. Is that correct?
Forgive me, because I don't know the finer details of how that would work across the Northern Ireland border. And I think Northern Ireland is a clear exception.
All right, well, say they're coming from somewhere else.
Don't
worry too much about that, but just what would happen to them and what they would have to incur in terms of cost. You're saying that anybody that would go and visit somebody outside of the UK and then came back into the country, and let's say it was for a funeral, death in the family, they would have to stump up £1,500 worth of costs in order to stay in a hotel under your policy.
Well, what we're saying is people shouldn't be leaving the country and returning, because that risks the increase of the virus spreading. Where there are people travelling across international borders, it's right that there's a quarantine put in place, and it's right that those people obey that quarantine at the moment, and that there's proper checking, because we don't have that system at the moment. 98% of people aren't being checked whether they're self-quarantining at the moment when entering the country, according to those latest stats, and that is really worrying. So the proposal that we're putting forward, that I think enjoys widespread public support, is that people should quarantine in a hotel. Those hotel spaces are largely empty at the moment. As someone who used to work in the travel industry for the Association of British Travel Agents, believe me, there's an awful lot of travel agents at the moment that could assist the government in booking hotel rooms if they wanted to gain that help. But look, it's too slow. That's the fundamental problem here.
All right,
There's so much progress, so much effort's been made, but we're risking it by allowing people to enter the country without those restrictions properly being in place.
But Luke, this policy and delivering it may not actually also be straightforward. Can I just ask again what Joe said? I mean, on this is a point of principle. If somebody wanted to go to the funeral of a loved one in another country, and then you were saying they had to quarantine when they came back, would Labour expect them to stump up the costs of staying in a hotel for a quarantine period because they wanted to go to the funeral of a loved one in another country?
Well, I think that there was an enormous number of difficult decisions that people have to take at this time. What we're suggesting is that for people that are entering the UK, coming back into the UK or coming here for the first time, that they should quarantine. And there will
But who should bear the cost? Because this is what, this is not a straightforward thing. You sound straightforward to call for it, but there are, as you say, many difficult decisions. So, on point of principle, if somebody has to travel for that kind of compassionate reason, should they have to bear the cost? Because this is one of the difficult decisions to make.
Well, it certainly is, and there are no easy answers to this, I'm afraid. I would love to be able to provide that reassurance, but these are difficult decisions that need to be taken here, and that's why it is really hard. As someone who's lost loved ones during the crisis, there are decisions that are about attending funerals and paying last respects that are deeply difficult and personal decisions to make. But at this very moment, the increase or the numbers of people travelling internationally are risking a spread of mutated versions versions of the virus. That's putting the huge efforts of the vaccination programme at risk. So there will be some really difficult circumstances. Of course there will.
All right.
And I'm not denying that that won't be the case. But I think this, on the whole, is something that we absolutely need to get on top of the virus and to really maximise the benefits of that vaccination programme that is at the moment going so well, but needs to continue going well. And that's why we need to control any imports of mutated versions of the virus from abroad.
Right, Mims, we hear from the Prime Minister and other ministers who keep saying that we have one of the toughest border regimes in the world. It's not true, that really, is it?
Well, I think you've only just seen, for example, that Germany have brought in a testing requirement for UK travellers on the 21st of
But compared to New
December.
Zealand, Australia, China, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Malaysia, it's not the toughest regime or even one of the toughest.
Well, Canada only brought in their pre-departure testing on the 7th of January. If I could just reiterate for viewers, we have got direct postcode testing for these particular variants. We're going door to door to support people. We've also done 100% of spot checks of all passengers entering the UK. PHE have been contacting 1,500 people a day. We've done 3,000 notice of intent in people who may be fined for not completing that passenger locator form. As you heard, the Home Secretary says there's more people, police at the airports reminding people about that quarantine, the fact that they must do that 72 hours test, an approved one before they travel, and that you frankly cannot go willy-nilly. And as you heard from Luke,
we know that,
people are
and you
having to make
said it.
very difficult decisions.
All right.
And I think it's important for people to know that we're not expecting people just to be going up and down the land for no apparent reason.
All
It's
right,
got
I'm going
to
to break
be very
in.
clear
I'm
why.
going to break in because we don't have that much time, and we understand the policy as you've explained it. Now we're going to go to Fact Check Joel because Boris Johnson accused Keir Starmer of repeatedly advocating staying in the European Medicines Agency, which Keir Starmer said he hadn't done. Joel, what's the truth?
Hi, Joe. As you say, there was this dispute about whether or not Keir Starmer has called for the UK to remain in the European Medicines Agency, which is an EU body. I've found a couple of quotes from January 2017 where he seems to be saying exactly that we should stay in the European Medicines Agency. These are both from the House of Commons. So he said, why would we want to be outside the European Medicines Agency, which ensures that all medicines in the EU market are safe and effective? And again, he said, the European Medicines Agency is one of the bits of the EU that we should be seeking to retain, not throw away. So it seems that Keir Starmer did call for the UK to remain in the European Medicines Agency after Brexit. But Boris Johnson was bringing this up to make a political point. And he said at PMQs that if we had done what Keir Starmer had called for, then we would still be in the starting blocks in terms of our vaccine rollout. And the idea there is that we would have had to wait for the European Medicines Agency to authorise our vaccines. But that point isn't right because EU law does allow countries that are in the European Medicines Agency to grant temporary authorization for their vaccines. And remember that until the end of last year, we were in the Brexit transition period, so we were still following EU laws. And this point was actually made by the MHRA, the UK medicines regulator, in a statement last November. They said that if a suitable COVID-19 vaccine candidate becomes available before the end of the Brexit transition period, EU legislation allows for temporary authorization of supply in the UK based on public health need. Okay. So I think that Keir Starmer was wrong to say that the UK should not, was wrong to say that it never called for the UK to stay in the EMA, but Boris Johnson was also wrong to say that that would have left our vaccine programme in the starting blocks.
Right, very diplomatic there. We'll end that discussion. I think it's cleared it up. Luke, I just want to refer, you've got the Union flag there behind you. You obviously don't have a problem with patriotism. Does the Labour Party?
No, the Labour Party is proud of our country, and it's the I've got the White Ensign behind me as a proud MP for Devonport, the country's largest naval base, and of course the Devon flag as well. And I think we should be unafraid of saying that we're proud of our country. Indeed, the Labour leaders throughout our entire party's history have done that. And what we need to make sure beyond that is that we're not just talking about a piece of cloth. We're talking about the values that makes Britain strong. And at the moment, we can see those values are on show in terms of the resilience, the fortitude, the huge expression of support for our National Health Service, that service. And that, for me, needs to go with it. It's not just a flag, it's not just a piece of cloth, it's the values that make Britain so great. And that is why we need to support that. But as someone who's proud to be English as well, I know your viewers will be having lots of different identities. I'm personally in favour of more flags that reflect the fact that I can both be proud to be from Plymouth, from Devon, from England, from Britain, and proud to be part of a bigger European family all at the same time. And just because I have a love of one doesn't mean that excludes me having a love of another. And that, I think, is the message that we've got to get across.
All right, well,
being
Luke,
proud of your country is something to be proud of.
Right, well, Luke has explained and talked about all of that very passionately. But in terms of the Labour Party as a whole, we heard the Prime Minister saying that the problem with Keir Starmer is he sits on the fence. We have had this strategy document revealed, the results of it, in a national newspaper, saying people don't know what Keir Starmer stands for. Is that beginning to have a problem for Keir Starmer?
I think that there is a growing murmur among people in the Labour Party, many of whom were very enthusiastic about Keir Starmer's leadership coming in, that whether or not they are really being able to cut through. Now, when you talk to people about in Keir Starmer's team, they basically say that opposition during a pandemic has been not impossible, but extremely difficult, because everybody knows the country appears to want politicians to work together. They wouldn't necessarily appreciate a more traditional conflict-seeking opposition. But I think it has given them a problem. And there is, when you sort of peel away the pandemic reason that's put forward, there is a question in some people's minds about whether or not Keir Starmer's sort of political personality is actually going to be able to sort of cut through Boris Johnson's bombast in an effective way when it really comes to it.
Well, we've literally only got 20 seconds. Luke, you've got 10 seconds to say what should he do?
Keep up the work of holding the government to account, continue campaigning on issues like the cladding, like the quarantine, like the free school meals.
Okay.
Labour's had the government on the run for quite some time.
All right, that's all we've got time for. Thank you for ending that for us, Luke, from all of us here. We'll be back tomorrow at 12:15.